Hello and welcome to Northampton Community College's Ethics and Moral Problems course. Today we'll be talking about the ethical issue of immigration, particularly in terms of associations and enforcement. Now, immigration, of course, is a timely issue in the second decade here of the 21st century, particularly in the United States. And not unlike other divisive issues, some aspects of the topics, they preclude rational discussion, which really is the foundation for philosophical thought and dialogue. What I mean is that there are elements in the cultural and political sphere that make it very hard for us to dialogue. So a couple of things up front that I should at least address. First of all, once again, this is a hot topic. But I want you to know that it's an error to consider, and I think you're aware of this, that there are simply, two sides to this particular issue. This is often the optics of the topic because there's extremes and they tend to be very vocal even if they're small in number. So much of the debate around immigration today centers on the support or the defense of open borders, and then there are periphery issues that spin off duties to other states, and by states we mean countries, protection of citizens, long-term residency, citizenry rights, and such. The other point is that we're going to have to keep in mind that there are competing goods that are always have to be held in tension here. And sometimes that's difficult, and that makes the conversation a little harder for us to have. In other words, every country has to have some notion of sovereignty, or they would never be able to say, for instance, that this country is our country and that's your country. That fact should be evident. So when we claim there's immigration laws must change, just the fact that we say immigration laws must change, we're referring to a governing body that has authority over a particular country. And without a specific area to be a country, no governing body really would have any authority to make changes. But the other tension is that equally, no sovereign country should exclude the rights of others to migrate for purposes ranging from imminent danger, which could include death but isn't only limited to that, to seeking a better life economically and politically. So, in short, the care for one's own people is important, but as is the care for others. So no country is an island, and I mean that in a relational, not geographical terms. So we're always going to have to try to find a way to keep these competing goods of sovereignty and ethical rights of all people in tension. We're then going to look at varying issues which can be understood as the underlying analysis of immigration, like what is involved in this issue. We're also going to look at immigration policy, like what to consider in enforcing immigration. It would be burdensome to tackle the complexities and specific issues, not the least of which would be a struggle to sort through the media hyperbole and all the partisanship, right, through which information is often disseminated. So I'm going to do my best to stay neutral. I'm only going to try to relay the thinking of the two people that we've read, Christopher Heath Wellman and Jorge Mendoza. And certainly you should and can critique their positions, as well as my presentation. But I do ask that first you try to comprehend their points prior to criticism. The reason is, you'll notice that in philosophy we always try to develop principles or rational reasons for thinking and acting as the way that we want to or think we should. So to counter an argument, in other words, if you disagree with something that you're hearing, it's really not enough to simply state, well, I think, and then offer your opinion, or to even use an example, something that happened to you, or something that happened to somebody you've heard and such. Those are very important, but they're anecdotal, right? There's no real way for us to be certain that your experience and my experience, or what you've read or what I read, could be true in other instances, or especially for all instances. So remember, the veracity of an argument, that is how true it is. It's never dependent on the level of outrage. So getting mad and furious doesn't prove our point. Though personally, I'll share with you, I do love people that have passion. Okay, all that said, let's first discuss the principle of the freedom to associate, as it's understood with the political thought of Christopher Heath Wellman. When Wellman claims that he has reached the stark conclusion that every legitimate state has the right to close its doors to all potential immigrants, he's not stating that they should. He means to say that you personally should feed the hungry and clothe the naked in your midst, for example. But you don't have to. Now, he forms this on the principle of the freedom to associate, which means that you can associate with those whom you want to, or not associate with those whom you want to. He compares this freedom to being able to marry whom you wish, or to join a religious community of your choice, etc. When he concludes the right to not associate, he's affirming those people who have the right to not marry you if they don't want to, or for a religious community to say, which people belong or do not belong to their group. And if they cannot say that, then what exactly constitutes their group? As in marriage, you have the right to stay single or marry, but that right belongs to others also to stay single and not marry you. He then makes the transition to countries by stating, in other words, if you're saying how does he go from these personal examples of um, marriage and such to the whole country, he says that one's country can't literally unilaterally annex another. In other words, the reason is that each country has proper borders which define them as a nation. And Wellman, he makes the case that while people in a country should care about political membership and immigration, he states that group self-determination is having control over the group, which in turn gets to be self-determining. In other words, he used an example that the United States can't simply go up and annex Canada, and the reason is because there's a border and there's certain sovereignty. Another reason he offers is that every country has duties towards distributive justice. Distributive justice are those things like, say, we collect taxes, so everybody pays in to the whole. That's the burden that citizens bear to the whole, and then it's justly distributed to those in need, the benefits to the citizens, so the burden of the whole to the members. Wellman next then considers an egalitarian case for or against open borders. So you notice how in philosophy you just start by saying, okay, so if we're going to accept this, let's talk about it and see what our particular positions would be if we were to hold this or that. Okay, so this is sometimes known as winning the citizenship lottery. In other words, none of us had control over the countries we were born into, and being born into thus became citizens. So, in the words of Joseph Cairns, he used citizenship in Western liberal democracies is really the equivalent to feudal privilege, right? It's an inherited status. You just happen to be born into an affluent Western society. And without summarizing all of Wellman's responses, let's at least consider his example where he talks about the three societies A, B, and C. First, he says, those in Community A, let's pretend that that group has all comparative wealth, so they're all equally prosperous. Those in Community B, they all have the same comparative poverty. So here you have both A and B that are pretty homogeneous as far as, let's say, economic levels, but they really know nothing of each other principally. But then he says, let's consider Community C, where there is a disparity that exists within the community. So this community has both the wealthy and the poor, and they are aware of each other. His argument is that we should be more concerned with eliminating the inequality in Community C. This was his response, let's say, to the distinction between relational equality and luck equality. For instance, people who are born into either Community A or Community B simply had a luck type equality. The equality with Community C, though, manifested itself more as a relational one within a state, and that should be the consideration over and above the luck to be in one of the other communities, either A or B. So he recognizes that luck is a factor in equality. In other words, it means something that you were just born there and you had no control over it. But he's trying to make the point that that's not the main factor, and it doesn't really override our freedom of association, which again means that people simply have the right to help or not help if they should. Even if he thinks they should, he's still saying they have the right to not do that. Now, he concludes that this is rather simplistic, and the disparity between A and B is often staggering. It's not just, marginal. And also that A and B, are not so connected and unaware of each other in the real world. We live in a global society. We have social media, and we have just mainstream media, and we see a lot of news from all over. So anyway, that's at least some summation of the principle of the freedom to associate. As we switch the mode here somewhat, in the political and social thought of Jorge Mendoza, there is a movement towards what is known as the ethics of immigration laws and their implementation. And it would be nice if there were just simply a straight path between, say, a state's ethical ethos, and our ethos is enshrined in law, and then the enforcement of those laws just result in the creation of justice within a society. But we all know that is not the case. It's very complex. We have laws, there's implementation of those laws, there's appeals and revisions which can be both just or unjust in their execution, laws that maybe don't perhaps meet real-life conditions, or laws with maybe that are so abstract that we don't know how to properly fit them to the messiness that we find in this issue of immigration. So if you find yourself agreeing with Wellman, then Mendoza's approach is going to challenge you. If you were challenged by Wellman's argument, then Mendoza's response might fit more closely with your understanding of the immigration issue. Anyway, with Mendoza, the situation with immigration is not whether there's a policy and then to simply argue about the morality employed to enforce that policy, which is what you typically hear in mainstream media. Rather, he says first to examine the morality of those strategies in order to see what kinds of policies are morally permissible in the first place. In short, the state is limited in determining the factors that lead to excluding and or admitting immigrants. They could be either internal or external factors that lead to that. So he starts out by saying, as for the external factors for immigration, his philosophical ethic is that one needs to consider the presumptive rights of the immigrant, which would include, for instance, their social, historical circumstances, their familial relationships, and the immigrant's economic realities. Then on these, over and above these things, on the internal consideration, Mendoza then makes the point that with immigration there are certain presumptive protective, or let's say protections, meaning that the way the internal policies are implemented should be ethically determined by, what he would call inequality of burdens and universal protections. Basically, does the policy ostracize minority communities socially and civilly? That's the question he's asking. So, Mendoza then speaks of those justified limits that somebody would have on, say, border, let's say border enforcement. So he begins by recognizing that one type of border enforcement is known as prevention through deterrence, and this often manifests itself in some military-style strategy. This would include natural barriers. In other words, between the two countries, especially in the southern United States, there's a type of terrain that itself becomes a deterrent. And in those other areas where the terrain is more hospitable and easier to cross, we have Border Patrol agents at these more accessible points of entry. So it was believed initially, say in the last 20 to 30 years, that having this type of enforcement of the border would lead to an increase. Well, let me say it this way: they realized that this probably would lead to an increase in migrant deaths. In other words, as migrants would utilize the unpatrolled areas where it's very inhospitable and the environments proved harsh, that sometimes their crossing would result in fatalities. The logic was that this became known by other people that were trying to migrate up, that would deter them or stave off migrant crossings. But the crossings, even at the remote areas, didn't necessarily decrease. So sometimes it's hard to know how this plays out. So Mendoza says this idea proved to be both expensive and ineffective, and unfortunately people died. He said one of the reasons this led to even higher migration levels in the U.S., ironically, was that it ended what was known as circular migration, where migrants might move more fluidly back and forth. They might work up here for a few months and then go back to the native country, then come back up and such and such. But once that these borders were more heavily guarded, it became too risky. So what happened was they stayed and they planted roots. So you saw an increase in migration, in immigrants taking residence in the United States. So Mendoza argues, contrary to Wellman, who did hold that legitimate states must respect individual liberty and equality, that border enforcement cannot really use these intrusive methods or practices because he says they infringe objectionably on the liberties of individuals and even migrants. This individual liberty then places limits on the kind of enforcement that one can use. Mendoza holds that, and we're still talking about this deterrence here a little bit. Mendoza holds that there are always these push factors from the countries of origin, like what makes somebody want to leave, and then there are these pull factors in countries of destinations, what draws them in. Now, Wellman's aid to other countries, remember, he thought that would be a way to stop an influx of immigrants. In other words, if we could help the native country, then it would take away the push factor. But that doesn't really address those immigrants who aren't leaving due to those push factors. In other words, Mendoza claims there's other reasons that people are leaving their countries simply because of those, so that doesn't quite address it. And I guess he would say, how does one even make the economy if we're going to be talking about the pull factors now, what do we do? Make our economy look less attractive? If people want to be with their families who are living in this country and they're not in this country, how do we make that desire not a pull? So he says, a liberal state, that has free markets, as in the United States, does not really have the same control as a totalitarian state would have that, could literally control all those things. Anyway, there's a lot that could be said in all of this. But I want to now turn to Mendoza's take on these internal limits. What is justified in the regard? I mentioned earlier that with internal issues, Mendoza held that the liberties of individuals could not be infringed on, at least not in an objectionable or in a moral way. So the ethical issue then with internal enforcement is that not all citizens, unfortunately, with these implementation of these policies are affected in the same way. That is, some minorities who are citizens will be harassed, and others who are non-citizens who do not fit the profile are not likely to have their lives disrupted unjustly. You may all know stories of people who are minority citizens who get pulled out or at least harassed because their citizenship is questioned, and then people who would not fit that profile that are just assumed to be citizens. That's his point. So the concern here is that, this attrition through enforcement runs the risk of not respecting the human rights that are due to all persons, regardless of their immigration status. Mendoza makes the case that there must be some canopy of protections that will equally shield both citizens and non-citizens from immigration enforcement excesses. And he's only talking about the excesses. What of the collateral damage? In other words, if raids can be conducted without a warrant, then even those groups that fit the profile, minorities who are citizens, are susceptible to unjust border burdens, regardless of their immigration status. This is what he means when he says there must be some equality of burdens as a standard used in internal immigration enforcement. Okay, but further then, this equality of burdens is not really sufficient in itself, and Mendoza states that there must also be present some universal protection standard, meaning just as it sounds, that all people, regardless of race, ethnicity, must share the same protection as the majority who are assumed to be citizens. Further meaning that there is first a presumption of innocence. This then is Mendoza's response to Wellman, in that this freedom to associate principle doesn't really hold up when it's applied to internal and or external enforcement. Now, it is likely that you will find yourself attracted to one of these angles on the immigration debate more so than others. It's also likely that you have some issues with each, and perhaps even find strengths in each. But part of this immigration issue being a topic for this ethics course is to offer a way to have the conversation without moving to some extreme pole, right, the sides, or to be able to confront another person's ideas, as Mendoza did to Wellman, and offer solutions without attacking him personally. You notice Mendoza never, did an ad hominem attack, nor did he personally attack Wellman. So each philosopher, both Wellman and Mendoza, they had important points to consider, and they have important points to consider. Wellman wrote prior to Mendoza's, but Mendoza's response to Wellman was respectful, and it was most of all was constructive. So that's the summation on this issue for at least this lesson in this course. Thank you for watching.